When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walked into that congressional chamber, he believed victory was already his. The applause was thunderous, the cameras were rolling, the narrative was set. But what he didn't see was the storm waiting in the back row. Jasmine Crockett sat silently, clutching a crimson folder that would destroy everything he stood for in under 10 minutes. One document, one photograph, one devastating truth. The entire hearing erupted into chaos. America watched in disbelief. But how deep does this conspiracy really go? And who else is hiding behind closed doors? Hold tight. This story will leave you speechless. The Grand Hall buzzed with electric anticipation. Every major news outlet had cameras positioned perfectly. Phone screens glowed across the nation. Headlines were already drafted. RFK Jr. champions medical liberty before Congress. The mahogany doors swung wide as Kennedy entered, draped in pristine white fabric that caught the studio lights like armor. Republican senators erupted in standing ovation, their cheers echoing off marble walls. To millions watching, he appeared as the champion of personal choice, the warrior fighting government medical tyranny. Kennedy acknowledged the crowd with practiced humility, his smile radiating confidence. He approached the witness table like a man who owned not just the moment, but the entire narrative. Every gesture calculated, every breath rehearsed. But in the chamber's final row, something dangerous waited. Jasmine Crockett remained motionless. No clapping, no acknowledgement, no movement except for the bright red folder balanced on her knees. Its cover bore stark black lettering. Confidential. Internal documents only. Her expression was granite, her focus laser-sharp, locked onto Kennedy like a predator studying prey. Around her, staffers whispered nervously. Committee members shuffled papers, but Jasmine's attention never wavered. She wasn't there for politics. She wasn't there for publicity. She carried something that would obliterate Kennedy's carefully constructed image in minutes. The room simply hadn't realized it yet. Kennedy's opening statement flowed like silk wrapped around steel, every word chosen with surgical precision, every pause designed for maximum impact. His ivory suit gleamed under the lights as he leaned toward the microphone. "Let me state this clearly." His voice carried absolute certainty, eyes scanning the room with practiced authority. "I refuse to apologize for returning freedom to American citizens." The phrase hit like a political lightning bolt. This wasn't testimony. This was a manifesto. Kennedy wasn't defending policy. He was declaring war on what he called medical authoritarianism. The Republican side of the chamber responded instantly. Senators leaned forward, magnetized by his words. Several nodded before he finished speaking. Others straightened in their chairs, ready to receive more wisdom from their medical freedom messiah. But Jasmine's hands remained steady, her pen moving in calculated strokes across government paper. She was building something, documenting everything, preparing for war. Kennedy continued, his momentum building like a revival preacher hitting his stride. "We have shattered the bureaucratic chains that suffocated medical choice." To casual observers, it sounded revolutionary. But Jasmine heard something entirely different. She heard erasure. What Kennedy called chains, she recognized as safeguards, the only protection between vulnerable communities and medical exploitation. What he claimed to liberate was actually the abandonment of oversight that kept poor neighborhoods from becoming testing grounds. "We've eliminated the mandates. We've destroyed the paternalism," Kennedy declared. The word paternalism struck with intentional force, designed to evoke images of government overreach. But for Jasmine and the communities she represented, paternalism wasn't the problem. Abandonment was. In her districts, there were clinics with broken equipment, doctors who appeared monthly, and mobile units that served as both treatment centers and experimental laboratories. Kennedy's policies hadn't eliminated paternalism. They had severed the fragile connections that barely kept her constituents alive. His final line dropped like a judge's gavel. "We have honored America's most precious principle, liberty above submission." The Republican bench exploded. Standing ovations erupted. Applause thundered through the chamber. One congressman actually whistled his approval. The sound bounced off ancient walls and surged through television screens into millions of homes. Kennedy smiled with quiet satisfaction. Not arrogant, just pleased. The mythology was writing itself in real time. But the cameras never captured Jasmine. If they had, they would have seen something chilling in her eyes. Not shock or anger, but cold recognition. She had heard these speeches before. Not the exact words, but the familiar rhythm of privilege disguised as revolution. To Kennedy, liberty meant the right to refuse. But to Jasmine's communities, liberty meant access, affordability, information, and protection from shadows where experimental programs masqueraded as healthcare initiatives. Her pen moved faster now. Names, dates, programs, timestamps. She wasn't just taking notes, she was loading ammunition. The applause was still fading when Jasmine moved. She didn't hesitate or request permission. She activated her microphone like igniting a fuse in a powder keg. The red indicator light blazed to life, and suddenly the chamber's atmosphere shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. Not physically, but psychologically. Safety vanished. She didn't raise her voice. Volume wasn't necessary. "Mr. Secretary," her words cut through the silence with scalpel precision. "Do you remember the Amunbridge initiative in Houston, Texas?" Every syllable landed with surgical accuracy. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was dissecting. She wasn't shouting. She was operating. The silence that followed wasn't from lack of interest. It was tension coiling, preparing for detonation. Kennedy's confident expression flickered. Just momentarily, but enough for trained observers to notice. His lips parted slightly, like a man asked about something he believed was permanently buried. His hand drifted toward his water glass, hesitated, then retreated as if the movement itself was incriminating. "That doesn't immediately come to mind, Congresswoman," he replied, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. That single sentence, vague, stalling, evasive, changed everything. Jasmine didn't react emotionally. Her silence was the reaction. She let his deflection hang in the air for exactly 2 heartbeats, long enough for everyone watching to hear the faint echo of guilt reverberating in his chest. Then, without raising her voice or leaving her seat, she opened the thick crimson folder and lifted a single page like someone revealing evidence at a murder trial. The sound of the binder rings snapping open broke the chamber's rhythm. Her movements were methodical, deliberate, certain. "Allow me to refresh your memory," she said, her voice now edged with the lethal calm of someone who wasn't there to debate. She was there to prosecute. The page rustled softly, but her words struck like hammers. This was a community outreach program, wasn't it? Conducted in a zip code where 85% of residents are Black or Latino, where 2 women, one aged 22, another 36, died within 48 hours of receiving your experimental immune response therapy, which, incidentally, never completed Phase 3 trials. No courtroom objections erupted. No smug interruptions came from the Republican side that had cheered minutes earlier. The air itself had changed composition, not disappeared but become dense, thick, difficult to breathe. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Jasmine didn't need their validation. She had documentation. From her folder, she extracted a single page and held it up. Not dramatically, clinically. The paper trembled slightly, not from her hand, but from the atmospheric tension itself. The camera zoomed in. On screen, the words were crystal clear. A header marked "Confidential," and beneath it, in unmistakable clarity, an electronic signature, R.F. Kennedy. "You claim not to remember it, Mr. Secretary," she continued with devastating calm, "but you authorized it." No gavel banged, no gasps echoed. Just that thick, heavy silence that only occurs when a room realizes it's no longer neutral territory. It's become a crime scene. Kennedy had built his reputation on freedom. Jasmine had just exposed its cost. For the first time that day, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. looked like a man sitting in the wrong chair. Jasmine's hands moved with mechanical precision, like a surgeon selecting instruments. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into the folder again, removing another document with the same careful deliberation. "This," she said evenly, her voice cutting through silence like wire through glass, "is an internal email from your senior policy advisor, Ethan Mercer, to Amunbridge Project Leadership, dated February 6, 2023. Subject line, Demographic Acceleration Protocol." She paused for exactly 1 second, enough for cameras to focus, enough for Kennedy's jaw to tighten visibly, then read verbatim. "Given the demographic concentration in the test region, it's imperative to accelerate subject enrollment. The ethnic profile is optimal for immune variability measurement." The words required no interpretation. They were clinical, cold, coded with decades of medical racism history. Jasmine lowered the paper slowly, deliberately, letting the quote saturate the oxygen-starved chamber. Her tone remained steady as a falling blade. "So not only did you fund this program, Mr. Secretary," she said with devastating calm, "your office specifically pushed for it to target communities based on race." The silence was no longer tense. It was electrified. No murmurs from the gallery. No breathing from the Republican section. The phrase ethnic profile hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Kennedy shifted visibly, blinking rapidly as if trying to reset the moment like a malfunctioning screen. His hand found the desk edge. His fingers curled once, then flattened. "That directive wasn't mine," he said, eyes darting toward his legal counsel. "I don't oversee every communication. I didn't authorize that language. I don't manage that project directly." Everything was unraveling. The smooth delivery was gone. The certainty, the righteous posture, the magnetic command, all dissolving. What replaced it was something Jasmine recognized better than Kennedy could imagine. A powerful man retreating behind the same bureaucracy he claimed to dismantle. The irony was bleeding through every syllable. The chamber was still processing Kennedy's retreat when Jasmine continued her methodical destruction. She leaned forward slightly, not for performance, but from gravitational pull. Her hand returned to the crimson folder. When she extracted the next set of documents, it wasn't with hesitation. It was with finality. These weren't arguments. They were facts, undeniable, traceable, stained with consequences. "This," she said calmly, placing the first document flat and sliding it forward, "is a certified wire transfer confirmation from North Liberty Health Initiative, a private fund controlled by your cousin, Gregory Kennedy." Her voice didn't spike. The numbers printed in bold black ink spoke for themselves. $1,200,000. That money was deposited directly into Amunbridge's operating account 6 days before the first test injections began in Houston. The evidence was fresh. The trail was clean. This wasn't distant, abstract funding. This was coordinated, internal, deeply personal. She paused just long enough for the committee to absorb that the blood money had a surname, his. She placed the second document beside the first, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Here's the CDC's internal review, marked confidential but obtained through subpoena. It outlines the compound used in Houston trials, an experimental immune response stimulant that had not passed Phase 3 safety testing, had not undergone peer review, and critically, had not been submitted for third-party toxicity screening." Her finger tapped a highlighted paragraph. "That means this compound should never have been administered to any human being, let alone in trials labeled as community care outreach." Kennedy didn't blink. What he had funded wasn't just reckless. It was biochemical roulette spun inside underserved neighborhoods. Then came the final evidence, and the room's temperature plummeted. She held 2 sheets with both hands, not for emphasis, but because their weight demanded steadiness. "And these," she said, lifting the papers side by side, "are the official death certificates of Lena Hargrave, 22 years old, and Carla Menendez, 36. Both residents of the testing zone. Both enrolled after being promised free immune-boosting therapy. Both dead within 48 hours. The words stung like exposed nerves, but she didn't flinch. She read directly from the documents, voice low, precise, unrelenting. Cause of death: acute immune system collapse consistent with unregulated antigen exposure. Nobody dared breathe. Not the panel, not the press, not Kennedy. Jasmine slowly placed the certificates between the funding documents and CDC report, creating a complete picture. An accusation built through structure, evidence, and irreversible truth. She looked at Kennedy, not with fury, but with something colder: accountability. "You speak about medical freedom, Mr. Secretary, but you never mention who pays the price." The room was breathless, but Jasmine understood the real audience extended far beyond marble walls. It stretched into living rooms, classrooms, barbershops, and hospital waiting areas, into every forgotten zip code where reform promises always came with hidden costs. She felt millions of eyes through the cameras, watching, waiting, not for political theater, but for someone to finally speak truth that had been suffocated for decades. The camera lights blinked steadily. National networks had split screens, but she wasn't performing for trends. She was prosecuting for justice. Her posture remained steady, but her breathing slowed. The microphone didn't crackle, it listened. She turned her head slowly, precisely, until her gaze locked with the center camera, the one feeding live to every major outlet. Her eyes didn't plead, they challenged. They carried weight. The weight of names erased from reports, statistics that once had smiles and birthdays and dreams. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened. Each word carried the gravity of centuries compressed into a single testimony line. "We are not laboratory animals, but in your vision, our skin color becomes permission for human experimentation." The sentence didn't need echo. It carried its own aftershock. It was truth that doesn't request validation. It demands you deny it. In that moment, the chamber became a confessional. The camera became a mirror. For the first time in that hearing, maybe in that entire building, someone had spoken not just to power, but through it. The weight of her words still hung like smoke that refused to clear. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Facts had been presented, documents dissected, a system exposed, yet she knew something deeper was required, something that forced even the most powerful man in the room to see beyond bureaucracy and confront the human cost, not as policy, but as people. She inhaled deeply, then reached into her blazer's inner pocket, not for more evidence, but for something far more damning. No folder this time, no legal seal, just a single photograph. Soft edges, slightly faded, carefully preserved. It didn't belong in an investigation file. It belonged on a dresser, a refrigerator, a mother's nightstand. Jasmine held it as if it were still warm from loving hands. She turned back to the committee, cameras, nation, and finally to Kennedy. Her voice didn't change pitch, but it carved deeper, cutting through stillness like careful incisions through skin. "This," she said, raising the photo, "is Malia." She was 22 inches. The chamber froze. The image in her hand showed a young black woman with bright eyes and natural curls pulled back with a headband, beaming in golden summer light. No file number, no signature, no timestamp, just life. Pure, undeniable life. Jasmine kept her gaze forward, arms steady as she held Malia up for the world to see. The silence around her wasn't empty. It was filled with breathless stares, pounding hearts, and the weight of every headline that never ran, every death that never reached prime time. Malia didn't come from wealth, Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering, but now soaked with something older than outrage, grief refined into determination. She didn't have private insurance. She didn't have the luxury of second opinions or access to executive health care. What she had was hope and a promise that someone in power had designed a program to protect her. She paused. Instead, she received an injection that no federal agency had approved. She received therapy whose only authorization was printed in financial reports, not medical journals. Then Jasmine turned to face Kennedy fully, not as a politician challenging policy, but as a human being confronting power with truth. "If this were your niece," she asked, her tone scalpel sharp and deliberate, "would you have allowed her to be injected with an untested drug?" The question didn't explode. It sank like a stone into still water, devastating in its simplicity. Silence flooded the space, but this wasn't just quiet anymore. This was reckoning. Kennedy blinked. His mouth opened slightly, as if some rehearsed response were forming, but nothing emerged. No pivot, no counterattack, no scripted deflection, just stillness, the kind that happens when the soul has nowhere to hide. He looked down, for the first time all day. In that simple act, the lowering of his eyes, something irreversible occurred. The posture that had carried him through hours of confident testimony collapsed. The armor carefully constructed from legal ease and political bravado cracked. He wasn't reviewing notes, he wasn't consulting staff. He was looking down because it was the only direction remaining. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink. She simply lowered the photograph with the same care she had raised it, returning Malia's dignity to her rightful place in the world. She placed the picture flat on the desk before her, not as evidence, but as memory, as resistance. Nobody spoke, not the chairman, not the press, not even Kennedy's allies who now looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the crusader, but the man. A man who had made choices, signed documents, and looked away when the cost had faces. The moment stretched unbroken. Nobody dared interrupt it. Because somewhere deep down, whether they would admit it on camera or not, every person in that room now understood the truth. This wasn't about reform. This wasn't about liberty. This was about the bodies that never got back up. And in that instant, as cameras quietly zoomed in on the devastation sitting on Kennedy's face and the quiet power radiating from Jasmine's, one thing became clear to the nation watching. Malia had not died in vain. Jasmine Crockett had just ensured that. Silence was never meant to shelter men like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It was a pause, a calculation, a loaded weapon waiting to misfire. He straightened slowly, almost mechanically, as if willing his spine to hold together what remained of his public image. The moment had cornered him. The room had turned. But his instinct wasn't reflection. It was retaliation. His eyes scanned the chamber, no longer pleading but searching for allies, escape routes, control. Then he launched, not with facts but with fury polished into political performance. "This is character assassination," he snapped, voice sharper now, chest rising with each word. "A political ambush orchestrated by Democratic operatives to destroy my credibility." His tone wasn't shaken. It was scorched, forged in the same righteous indignation that once made him a populist hero. But now it rang hollow, defensive, desperate. He turned, glaring at Jasmine without using her name. "This isn't oversight. This is emotional manipulation, exploiting tragedy, performing for cameras." The accusation hung heavy, almost sounding rehearsed, as if prepared for the moment he would inevitably lose control. He grabbed frantically for a binder beside him, flipping through laminated charts and reports with manic energy. Pulling out a page, a printed WHO memorandum, he held it high like it could somehow erase the photograph still lying before him. The WHO has confirmed that the Amunbridge pilot operated under strict international monitoring, he declared, voice rising into defensive crescendo. All procedures followed global protocols. All adverse events fell within expected parameters. But nothing moved. Not a breath, not a blink. The paper in his hand, backed by acronyms and technicalities, might as well have been blank. No chart could sterilize the image of Malia's face still glowing on the table. No global protocol could sanitize the reality of two dead women whose names had only just been spoken aloud. In that brutal stillness, one thing became undeniable. Kennedy was speaking, but nobody was listening. The remnants of Kennedy's rebuttal still hung in the air like smoke after a failed explosion. His datasheet trembled in his grip, not from wind, but from irrelevance. Behind him, even sympathetic lawmakers had fallen silent, not from loyalty, but from fear that their own reputations were drifting into the crosshairs. Jasmine observed it all, the flickering power, the eroding defenses. But she wasn't finished. "Madam Chair," she said without breaking eye contact with Kennedy, "with your permission, I'd like to call one final witness." The silence that followed wasn't procedural, it was primal. The room held its breath, as if it already sensed that something irreversible was about to walk through those doors. A name was announced. Footsteps echoed from the chamber's rear. The heavy wooden doors opened. No fanfare, no entourage, just one man. He didn't walk like someone eager to testify. He walked like someone who couldn't bear to remain silent anymore. His nameplate read, Dr. Cole Martin, Senior Systems Technician, Amunbridge Project. But the weight on his shoulders conveyed far more than any credentials ever could. He wasn't dressed for television. No expensive suit, no polished shoes, just a clean but wrinkled shirt, denim jeans, and the raw exhaustion of a man who had carried secrets too long. He raised his right hand, took the oath, sat in the witness chair like it might collapse under the weight of what he was about to reveal. His eyes scanned the room once, then settled on nobody in particular. And then he began. "We knew the drug wasn't properly tested," he said, voice low but unwavering. The words didn't echo. They landed heavy, sharp, real. They pierced through legal defenses and media spin like a nail driven straight into the project's foundation. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. She had already done her part. Now the system was cannibalizing itself. Dr. Martin inhaled as if preparing for the collapse of everything he had helped build. "We were instructed to remain silent. The people weren't informed of the risks, not the complete truth, not even close." There it was, the breach. Not in science, not in medicine, but in morality. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, lips tightening between sentences the way they do when regret stops being abstract and finally becomes memory. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Staffers exchanged stunned glances. Even committee members shifted uncomfortably, their previous defenses now folding like paper barriers in a storm. But Cole Martin wasn't finished. His next sentence didn't just shift the atmosphere, it shattered it. "I feel like I betrayed their trust." Nobody moved. The sentence wasn't delivered for sound bites. It wasn't crafted for virality. It was the bleeding truth of a man who had watched the system destroy people and said nothing until now. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried a fracture, something that had broken long before this hearing began. For a moment, the entire room seemed to sag under the weight of what had just been spoken. Because this wasn't Jasmine saying it. This wasn't a grieving family member. This wasn't even a political opponent. This was one of their own. A white man, a scientist, a technician, a witness, a participant, and now a penitent. Across the aisle, Kennedy's face froze. Not in anger, not in confidence, but in something far more telling. Recognition. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. Because in that moment, the defense he had tried to construct with WHO memos and political deflection had been obliterated. Not by partisanship, but by someone who had seen it from the inside. No grand gestures, no breaking composure, just slow, undeniable erosion of credibility collapsing under the simple weight of confession. Perhaps most devastating of all, Dr. Cole Martin's voice, the voice of someone who had been complicit, now held more moral authority than the man who had stood at the podium claiming to defend freedom. Because guilt, when spoken honestly, is more powerful than any prepared speech. Cameras remained fixed on him because America wasn't watching a chart or debate or even scandal. It was watching the cost of silence. And Cole Martin had just broken his. Truth didn't just land, it exploded. Once the chamber fell silent, the nation began to scream. It started with flashing banners across every major news network. Red alerts, white block text, urgent tones. Breaking! Whistleblower confirms unauthorized drug testing in minority communities. Within minutes, headlines fractured across the digital landscape. Fox News interrupted its planned senatorial interview mid-sentence. CNN canceled its prime-time panel. MSNBC dropped scheduled global market coverage. All three networks, divided by politics but united by outrage, switched to emergency live coverage, synchronizing their coverage for the first time in years. The hearing footage looped endlessly. Jasmine holding Malia's photograph, Kennedy looking down, Cole Martin speaking the words that transformed a policy scandal into something criminal. By sunset, over 83 million Americans had watched the moment live or replayed it within 2 hours. By midnight, that number had nearly doubled. The public response didn't simmer. It erupted. Within 6 hours, more than a dozen civil rights organizations issued simultaneous statements demanding immediate criminal investigation into the Amunbridge program, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and all administrative staff connected to the funding trail. The ACLU, NAACP, Southern Poverty Law Center, and Human Rights Watch, usually fractured by strategy, spoke with one unified voice. This was not oversight. This was human experimentation disguised as outreach. The American Medical Association released a scathing letter condemning the deliberate circumvention of FDA protocols, calling it a betrayal of both public health and public trust. Protest demands were drafted before sunrise. Petitions crossed the 1 million signature mark before breakfast. And the streets didn't wait for verdicts. They became one. By morning rush hour, the front steps of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services were swallowed in a sea of bodies. Not just in Washington, D.C., but in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Houston, cities where communities of color knew exactly what it felt like to be offered silence disguised as access. They came with signs that didn't ask questions. They demanded justice. I am not a test subject. Who authorized this? Malia had a name. College students, nurses, clergy, and veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, their chants rhythmic, rising like a heartbeat in the nation's chest. Some held up the now iconic image of Malia, not printed from news outlets but photocopied, hand-drawn, projected onto walls and buildings like sacred truth that could no longer be ignored. At least 7 different protests blocked major roads in downtown Atlanta by noon. In New York, demonstrators shut down traffic outside the CDC regional office with coordinated silence, mouths taped shut with red X's, standing still for 22 minutes in honor of Malia's age. By mid-afternoon, the White House briefing room was standing room only, packed with reporters from every continent. The press secretary's face was pale, her prepared statement trembling in her hand as she read from it. The administration is shocked and deeply disturbed by the information revealed in today's congressional hearing. The President has ordered the Department of Justice to open an immediate and independent investigation. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. Effective immediately. The Department of Health and Human Services is under federal review, and Secretary Kennedy has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. It wasn't enough. Outside the building, the crowd roared. Online, hashtags exploded. Number Justice for Malia, number Not Your Lab Rat, number Amunbridge Betrayal, number Medical Apartheid, 2025. Celebrities joined the outrage. Physicians posted videos tearing up their certifications in protest. Former FDA administrators called for subpoenas. Members of Congress from both parties began drafting bipartisan resolutions demanding full federal transparency on all government-funded pharmaceutical testing over the past decade. The term medical apartheid re-entered the American lexicon, not in textbooks but in TikToks with millions of views. What began as a policy scandal was now a national reckoning. Leaked internal memos from Amunbridge began surfacing through whistleblower channels. One showed a risk assessment table with race-coded variables. Another instructed researchers to minimize language that implies uncertainty when communicating with minority participants. These weren't footnotes. They were smoking guns. By evening, legal analysts were calling it the most ethically damning medical scandal since Tuskegee. But even that comparison felt inadequate. Inside the Department of Justice, lights burned through the night. Federal agents were dispatched to secure servers, seize files, and freeze all Amunbridge-related assets. The Attorney General issued a rare on-camera statement, breaking protocol. Let me be clear. If laws were broken, prosecutions will follow. Titles will not protect anyone. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't post on social media. She didn't give interviews. She didn't issue statements. She simply walked out of the Capitol that evening, stepped into a sea of reporters, and made her way through the crowd, alone, steady, silent. Yet even in that silence, she had already become something more than a congresswoman. She was now a symbol, a scalpel that cut through the tissue of denial, a mirror held to a government that had once again forgotten who it was supposed to serve. The system had been exposed. The people had risen. The machine had no place left to hide. But as protests grew louder and headlines sharpened, the man at the storm's center finally broke his silence. Not in a courtroom, not before a committee, but in a carefully controlled press conference flanked by flags, staff, and a podium polished to deflect reflection. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stepped before cameras with none of the righteous defiance that once defined him. The light no longer haloed him, it exposed him. His expression was taut, jaw clenched, suit darker than usual, as if he understood the moment required mourning but refused to say what had died. I have chosen, he said, measured and methodical, to temporarily step aside from my duties as Secretary of Health and Human Services, effective immediately, to ensure the integrity of the ongoing federal investigation. His tone was cool, professional, the voice of a man trying to present retreat as responsibility. This is not an admission of wrongdoing, he continued. It is recognition that my continued presence may distract from the facts that must now emerge. But he didn't say the words the nation waited for. He didn't say resign, didn't say sorry. He said pause. And the world heard privilege. Across the country, headlines began with the same phrase. Kennedy steps back, but not down. Editorials erupted. The New York Times ran a split front page, one side featuring Malia's smiling photo, the other showing Kennedy's statement. Beneath it, a single word caption, unfinished. Civil rights leaders called it a farce. Protesters returned to HHS steps, this time with pillows and sleeping bags. "You don't get to pause accountability," one sign read. "She didn't get to pause dying." But not everyone turned on him. Within hours, conservative lawmakers rushed to reframe the narrative. Senator Madison Rohr, R. Texas, called the resignation calls a modern-day witch hunt. Representative Paul Gentry, R. Ohio, went further. "This isn't about ethics. It's about power. They want to destroy a Kennedy because he wouldn't kneel to the medical-industrial complex." On Fox News, primetime anchors floated conspiracy theories that the whistleblower had been groomed by liberal strategists, that Malia's death was unrelated, that the hearing was a scripted takedown. Right-wing social media lit up with hashtags like #Jasmine the actor, fueled not by fact, but by fear of the political earthquake Jasmine had unleashed. Meanwhile, Kennedy's name remained etched on his office door. He still received daily briefings, still had security, still held power to shape policy through surrogates operating quietly beneath his public frieze. For all practical purposes, he had stepped back, but his hands remained dangerously close to the levers of power. Inside the halls of Congress, the fracture was immediate and violent. The House Oversight Committee, now under crushing public pressure, convened an emergency session. The footage of Malia's photo, the internal emails, the funding trail, Cole Martin's testimony, all of it was entered into the official record. But even the record trembled under the weight of what came next. Representative Luis Calderon, D. California, voice shaking with restrained fury, introduced a resolution to begin impeachment proceedings against Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on grounds of willful negligence, abuse of federal authority, and ethical malfeasance resulting in civilian death. The motion didn't just pierce the chamber, it split it wide open. Some Democrats cheered, their voices echoing like thunder in a room made brittle by weeks of tension. Others looked to leadership, hesitant, not because they doubted the facts, but because they feared what a full political war would unleash. Across the aisle, Republican lawmakers exploded into protest. Some walked out. Others shouted over their colleagues. One slammed a binder shut so hard it cracked his own microphone. The Speaker of the House, visibly shaken, slammed the gavel repeatedly. "Order! This chamber will return to order." But the room wasn't listening anymore. Because impeachment wasn't just a legal motion now. It was a political litmus test. In the days that followed, America watched its legislature descend into moral trench warfare. Editorial boards took sides. Church pulpits turned into protest platforms. Political commentators screamed on split screens, not about what happened, but who should be blamed for letting it happen. Swing state districts exploded in polling volatility. Fundraising emails flew from both parties, some using Malia's name as a rallying cry, others using Kennedy's as a martyr call. Capitol Police began reinforcing security barriers, not for external threats, but for the internal fire they knew was coming. All while Kennedy said nothing, did nothing, but didn't leave. To his supporters, he was now a symbol of institutional persecution, a man under siege for daring to question the system. To his critics, he was something far worse, a man so embedded in the system that not even death, documents, or dissent could pry his hands off the steering wheel. And to Jasmine Crockett, watching the chaos unfold from her office window as protesters chanted below, he was exactly what he had always been. Proof that truth alone was never enough. Justice still had to fight to breathe, and right now it was gasping. Amid the fury, the lies, the posturing, and the slow-turning wheels of government, the one voice that had lit the match stepped forward one final time, not with vengeance, not with rage, but with the burden of truth carried to its conclusion. The press conference was announced only an hour in advance. No preamble, no press kits, no leaks, just a cryptic message from her office. Jasmine Crockett will speak. No questions, no edits. By the time she stepped onto the makeshift podium at the edge of Capitol Hill, over 46 million people were already watching live. Camera crews scrambled for angles. Drones hovered overhead. The crowd behind barricades was silent, packed shoulder to shoulder. Some still held signs with Malia's face. Others just held each other. Jasmine Crockett walked to the microphone alone. No entourage, no security flanking her shoulders, no notes in her hand. She was dressed in dark navy, simple, intentional, the kind of color that didn't draw attention but commanded it anyway. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were unwavering. When she began to speak, the world didn't just listen, it held its breath. Her voice came clear, calm, and unwavering, not emotional, but irrevocable. "We cannot call this health policy," she said, pausing between each word like they weighed more than the podium beneath her, "when it kills the poor." The statement didn't echo. It detonated across every screen, every feed, every avenue where truth had once been diluted into euphemism. This cut clean. Journalists stopped typing. Protesters stopped chanting. The Capitol behind her seemed to stand still. She continued, each word measured not for impact but for accuracy. The idea of freedom cannot exist when it is built on the lives of people of color. There it was. Not the accusation, not the argument, but the revelation that this was never about a broken program or rogue policy or one man in one suit. This was about a system that had convinced itself its violence was procedure, its silence protocol. And Jasmine had torn away its veil without shouting, without screaming, without compromise. She didn't speak for headlines. She spoke for those who never got one. In the silence that followed her words, you could hear everything else America had refused to hear. The sound of a mother being told her daughter died of complications. The sound of a community realizing it had been selected, the sound of no apology. She didn't need to speak again, but she did. Not because cameras demanded it, but because history did. She looked down for the first time, not out of shame, but as if remembering something sacred. Then looked back up and said nothing for almost 8 seconds. Then she exhaled, not from exhaustion, but release. Her shoulders relaxed. Her voice didn't waver. It deepened the way it does when grief finally finds its language. "We are not test subjects," she had said days earlier, "and I will not let this country forget that." And she hadn't. Not for a second. When she turned and walked away from the podium, she didn't look back. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't smile for cameras. She didn't nod to staff. She simply walked forward into the crowd, into the storm, into the place where her name would no longer just belong to a committee room or voting roll, but to something larger. The next morning, Time ran her photo on the cover. Not the one from the hearing, not from the podium, a candid shot of her stepping through the crowd after the press conference, eyes forward, the Capitol blurred behind her. The headline was simple, "The Torch." The subheading read, "Jasmine Crockett, the light of justice in the age of silence." Social media lit up, but not with noise, with clarity. Writers called her a moral architect. Educators called her required reading. Young organizers across the country began hosting torch teach-ins, where students recited her words aloud, projected on school gym walls. Among the protesters, now thousands strong, a new chant rose. "Not your subject, not your silence. We are the price. She lit the fire." Jasmine Crockett didn't answer questions that week. She didn't appear on Sunday shows. She declined every profile, every glossy magazine shoot, every award nomination that followed. She said what she came to say. And sometimes that's enough to shift the axis of a nation. Long after Jasmine walked away from the podium, long after chants faded and signs were lowered, the system itself had to speak. And this time, it did. Within 48 hours of her final remarks, the Department of Justice announced that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had been formally removed from his position as Secretary of Health and Human Services. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, effective immediately. The statement read, "Mr. Kennedy no longer holds any executive authority within the department." But behind the language was a rupture, a once unshakable legacy reduced to an empty chair and a nameplate tossed into a box. Federal subpoenas were issued before sunrise. His communications, financial records, involvement with Amunbridge and its shadow affiliates, all placed under the microscope of a special investigative panel. This time there would be no podium, no charts, no retreat behind phrases like data variance or statistical ambiguity. What lay ahead wasn't strategy, it was survival. Because now Kennedy wasn't just disgraced, he was a defendant in waiting. Meanwhile, the country turned not away from the fire, but toward the one who had lit it. Jasmine Crockett, once dismissed as too emotional, too loud, too young, was now a name whispered with reverence across classrooms and courtrooms alike. Her photo, walking alone from the Capitol, backlit by dying sun, was hung in libraries, projected on campus auditoriums, taped to protest banners in cities she had never visited. Editorials called her the new Frederick Douglass in the digital age. Former presidents, even those once reluctant to speak, publicly praised her courage. Civil rights legends, weathered by decades of marches and betrayal, stood and applauded when she entered rooms, not because she had won, but because she had made the world watch what losing actually looked like. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a symbol, not of hope, but of reckoning. Outside the glare of headlines and history, two families remained frozen in a different kind of timeline. Malia Hargrave's mother still hadn't taken her daughter's name off the mailbox. Every time mail arrived, she stared at it unopened, unsure whether to scream or weep. Carla Menendez's sister still carried the voicemail, the last one sent 30 minutes before her final injection. She played it sometimes before bed, just to remember the cadence of her voice when she was still planning the weekend. The settlements hadn't come. The hearings dragged on. In the cracks of the system Jasmine had exposed, these two families still waited, not for money, but for language. For someone to say clearly without euphemism, they were targeted. They were expendable. They mattered. They waited. And they weren't alone. Across the country, Freedom of Information Act requests quadrupled. Advocacy groups filed lawsuits to unseal documents dating back 20 years. University students launched crowdsourced investigations into underreported medical programs conducted in rural towns and marginalized neighborhoods. Podcasts sprung up like wildfire, each with the same question beating beneath the surface like a hidden drum. How many more trials happened that we never knew about? It was no longer rhetorical. It was a national obsession. Cable news ran special reports with titles like The Forgotten Trials, Consent and Consequence, The Other Malias. Data analysts compiled lists of unexplained trial deaths tied to low-income clinics. Retired nurses began speaking anonymously to reporters, telling stories about vans that showed up once a month with syringes and clipboards, then vanished. Lawsuits reached double digits. Congressional aides whispered about other programs that hadn't yet surfaced. Amunbridge was no longer just a scandal. It was a spotlight, and no one could tell where its edge would stop. Meanwhile, Kennedy stayed out of sight but never out of frame. Each week brought new revelations, new leaks, new audio recordings. Committee hearings loomed. Some said the DOJ might pursue manslaughter. Others whispered something darker, that the Amunbridge trials had only been the tip of something more deliberate. The truth was uncertain, but one thing was not. Jasmine had broken the dam, and now the floodwaters refused to stop. On the anniversary of Malia's death, vigils were held in 26 cities, not just for her, not just for Carla, but for the unnamed, unrecorded, erased. Candles flickered against courthouse walls. Children wore T-shirts reading, "You don't experiment on people, you protect them." In the background of every broadcast, every vigil, every whisper that filled the lungs of a grieving country, the same sentence rose again, not as outrage, but as an unanswered prayer. How many more? How many more trials? How many more bodies? How many more names we never learned? Because they were never meant to be known. The country had changed, but the wound remained open, and Jasmine Crockett, still walking forward through the wreckage she refused to turn away from, knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But the spotlight Jasmine had ignited was about to illuminate something even darker. In a dusty federal archive room in Bethesda, Maryland, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and behind steel drawers untouched for decades, a junior legal aide named Marcus Lee stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to find. It wasn't marked classified, it wasn't redacted, it was simply forgotten. A manila folder, faded from time and moisture, labeled in handwritten ink, Project Delta Cross, 1997. Inside were patient records, test site memos, and a letter addressed to the Department of Defense flagging concerns about an experimental immune response booster trial on low-income veterans suffering from PTSD. No consent forms, no family notifications, no published outcomes. At the bottom, a familiar signature, not Kennedy's, but his predecessor's. A name still sitting on multiple nonprofit boards overseeing health care in minority communities. Marcus didn't speak. He scanned the pages. The weight hit him, not just the data, but the pattern. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a structure, one that had learned to bury its blueprints in plain sight. He forwarded the file to Jasmine's office under a pseudonym. And so the cycle threatened to begin again. Across the country, those once too afraid to speak began to whisper. Families in Alabama, veterans in Fresno, migrants in Detroit, each began checking records, asking questions, connecting dots they'd long tried to ignore. Jasmine's team was flooded with over 800 new tips within 2 weeks, some credible, some chaotic, but all haunted by the same question. How long has this really been happening? Though Jasmine's voice echoed across Capitol Hill, the real force was now decentralized. It lived in neighborhood coalitions, in late-night research sessions by ordinary citizens, in community forums packed wall-to-wall with people clutching photocopied documents and a hunger for truth. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the end of denial. The lies had been surgically exposed, but the infection had roots deeper than anyone had dared imagine. Yet now, for the first time in a generation, sunlight was seeping into corners, long thought unreachable. Jasmine's call had awakened a nation. But the people, they were the ones who chose not to go back to sleep. The glare of the spotlight didn't soften as Jasmine walked back onto the stage one final time. It sharpened, honing every line of her face into a declaration. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. Because she wasn't here to soothe, she was here to ignite. Jasmine stepped up to the podium, hands flat on the surface as if she needed the contact to steady the force of her words. The room fell to a hush so heavy, it felt like the world was holding its breath with her. Cameras refocused, journalists repositioned. But this moment wasn't for them. It was for everyone who had been kept in the dark. Today, Jasmine's voice cut through the stillness with quiet ferocity, the time for waiting is over. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. She paused just long enough to let it crack through the silence, then continued. We have uncovered lies hidden inside laboratories, excuses whispered behind boardroom doors, deaths buried inside bureaucratic redaction. She leaned forward, her words sharpening each syllable. We have demanded medical freedom, but freedom for whom if not for all? Not when it's freedom built on the backs of those who never got to say yes. Her audience leaned in across screens and districts. She didn't allow them to blink. Here's what happens next. She pulled a stack of documents wrapped in red ribbon from the podium shelf. Signatures, petitions, legislative drafts, the tangible weight of popular outrage. First, we demand that the Department of Justice release every single Amunbridge document in full. No redactions, no summaries, no exceptions, within 30 days. This isn't about privacy, it's about justice. The audience breathed with her. Second, we will formally introduce the Community Health Justice Act in the upcoming legislative session. This act will require any clinical trial recruiting participants from underserved communities to report real-time data, funding sources, FDA status, and independent oversight. It will include criminal penalties for anyone who conceals adverse events or falsifies consent documents. She lifted her gaze to the cameras, her eyes burning with resolve. Third, I call on the American people, on each of you watching, to rise and be heard. Flood your representatives with calls, emails, messages. Innocent people's lives were gambled away under the cloak of medicine. Silence now equals complicity. Delay will cost lives. Your action right now could define whether history remembers this moment as healing or horror. The room remained still, her conviction filling the space. She didn't soften, she pressed. And lastly, she said, voice resonating with purpose, we ask every one of you not just to watch history, but to make history. Check your local clinics, ask to see consent forms, demand transparency, elevate the names of those silenced. She gestured to the easel displaying Malia's photograph. Because when we forget them, we repeat the injustice. A hum started, quiet at first, then swelling. Reporters opened notebooks. Citizens leaned forward at home. Headlines began writing themselves. Jasmine retrieved another document, a letter addressed to the Secretary of HHS, the Attorney General, and FDA Commissioner. Today, we submit this petition signed by 2.3 million Americans demanding mandatory informed consent disclosure for federally funded trials in vulnerable communities, independent oversight by nonprofit review boards, and criminal accountability for government or corporate actors when negligence results in death. She held the letter up, the ink fresh from signatures. It felt sacred. This petition is not symbolic, she said. It is legal, it is moral, and it is a promise. The energy in the room shifted, charged now, like the moment right before a verdict is read. Jasmine didn't step back. She did the opposite. This is more than policy, she said, unwavering. This is not another bill to debate. This is pressing for justice, because lives can't wait. Lives shouldn't have to wait. And if we falter again, history will judge us not by the truths we exposed, but by the lives we failed to save. The last line landed like a verdict. She lowered the letter, letting silence fall. Heavy, resolute, conclusive. The movement surged forward, but a quieter reckoning was just beginning. The cycle threatened to repeat, but this time, the people were watching. Jasmine's call had awakened a nation. The lies had been surgically exposed, but the infection ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Yet for the first time in a generation, sunlight was seeping into corners long thought unreachable. The people had chosen not to go back to sleep. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Across the country, those once too afraid to speak began to whisper. Families in Alabama, veterans in Fresno, migrants in Detroit. Each began checking records, asking questions, connecting dots they'd long tried to ignore.